Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hi, I'm Ann Briggs, Public Relations and Engagement Coordinator, and your host for today's episode of the Water for Food podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Dan Snow, Research Professor and Director of the Water Sciences Lab at the University of Nebraska. Dr. Snow joined the Water Sciences Lab in 1990 as the laboratory manager and became the lab director in 2003. He oversees Water Sciences Lab staff and operations, using analytical chemistry to help understand how water becomes contaminated and what we can do to prevent it. A large portion of his work at the lab involves creating analytical methods for new or emerging environmental contaminants, including new classes of pesticides, pharmaceuticals, algal toxins, steroid hormones, and even explosives in environmental samples. Dr. Snow leads in the development of new methods to measure and use stable and radioactive isotopes as tracers to study environmental problems and processes. The Water Sciences Lab is located on UNL's East Campus and is part of the Nebraska Water Center and the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute. Their mission is to provide technology, expertise, services, and training in advanced analytical science supporting today's water and natural resources students, researchers, and stakeholders. The lab acts as a service center, testing samples from resource managers, agencies, and researchers in Nebraska and beyond. Dan, I'm excited to talk with you today about your work at the lab and the state of water quality research in Nebraska and beyond. We always like to start off with the story of how you got here. So tell us about where you grew up, your early career experiences, and what made you interested in water quality research.
Sure. Thanks, Ann. Well, that's taken me back. I grew up on a farm in southwest Iowa, Montgomery County, and I probably got most interested in water about that time. One of my vivid recollections was having to clean out our farm well, domestic well, and it was then that I really started to realize the vulnerability of groundwater contamination. I was very active in vocational agriculture, science and math club. I had our home well tested by the science and math club. So it kind of started out in citizen science really early. And then my guidance counselor kind of asked me what I wanted to do. I thought about engineering. I actually applied to Iowa State for an electrical engineering program, but the math sort of turned me off a little bit. So my guidance counselor suggested maybe a science field would be more appropriate. And geology just seemed like something that I'd be able to spend a lot of time outdoors, study the environment, study water, and that's kind of what led me to getting an undergraduate degree in geology from Missouri, a master's degree in geochemistry in Louisiana. While I was in Louisiana, I was thinking about whether I wanted to continue in graduate school, and I came across a journal, Groundwater, which is published by the National Groundwater Association, and started reading about it. And that really kind of honed my passion for doing a PhD in groundwater. At the time, University of Nebraska was one of the strongest programs in doing research and studying about groundwater. So I applied to the graduate program and got accepted. I came to Lincoln in 1986 and started my PhD. So it was shortly after that, I guess a few years after that, that I became lab manager. And that's kind of what has kept me here, having a full-time job and getting a PhD and being able to study groundwater.
Thanks, Dan. Well, we're glad that the university brought you in and that you decided to stay here. You've been really valuable to our lab. We'd love to hear about some of the projects that you and the lab are working on now, some of the research that's happening both in the state and then just in water quality in general.
Yeah, so a couple of things I learned early on was about the Vados zone, and that's one of the big projects I sort of have been working on the last 5 to 10 years was going back to areas that were cored by my PhD advisor and some of his students looking at nitrate occurrence and transport through the Vados zone. That's one of the biggest projects I think I've been doing lately with the natural resources districts and city utilities, is to look at how quickly nitrate is moving through the Vados zone into the water table. I think that's one that it really connects the surface to groundwater, and my ability to go back in time really and document how things have changed is really kind of cool, in my opinion, cool science. Another area has to do more with the emerging contaminants work. We were looking at the occurrence of neonicotinoid insecticides and fungicides in surface water long before the Altan Bioenergy incident occurred. So we kind of had the methods and the technology to measure these insecticides and fungicides, in part because this is a pretty agriculturally intensive state. These are new classes of pesticides that have only been used for about the last 20 years. And really having the Water Sciences Laboratory already having methods in place allowed us to contribute a lot to understanding the occurrence of these compounds after they were applied in the watershed up around Mead, Nebraska.
Now, I'd love to step back for just a minute. Can you explain for our listeners what is the Vados zone and how is that valuable with the water quality research that you're doing?
Sure. Vados zone is the interval between the crop root zone and the water table. So it's a lot of it is thought of as a filter. It can be serve as a filter for purifying water after it recharges from the surface and before it gets to the water table. It also serves as a storage compartment for contaminants like nitrate and some geogenic compounds like uranium and arsenic. So we're really trying to understand, well, what happens after water passes through the surface and goes through the Vados zone. It's kind of a mystery. And that's kind of what makes it intriguing, is that most people don't think about that interval between the root zone and the water table and what happens there.
Now, the Water Sciences Lab is well known for creating custom methodology to address unique water quality challenges. Can you tell us a bit more about that process of creating new methods and how the lab is set up to be able to both manage and create a wide range of testing methods?
Yeah, so I mentioned the insecticides and fungicides. We were starting to work on those for a professor in entomology who was interested on how these would affect honeybee production of honey and whether or not these insecticides would affect honeybee health. Long before we were interested in looking at them in water and surface water systems. And it was when he approached us and asked if we could measure these compounds that we started developing the methods for insecticides, these neonicotinoid insecticides. And then shortly after that, it was a scientist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was also interested in whether or not these are occurring in surface water and whether or not they might be affecting aquatic organisms. So we sort of gradually progressed from looking at terrestrial occurrence and effects into aquatic systems. And then the more we studied it, the more compounds we wanted to be able to measure. And at that time, Dr. Tiffany Messer joined the faculty at University of Nebraska, Biological Systems Engineering. And she had done a little bit of work as a postdoc at Duke University on these compounds and wanted to expand that work. And it was at that time we started looking at all these degradation products that are formed at the surface and really what the potential toxicity is for all of these metabolites, the degradation products. So it's a progression, going from one science project to another science project to another science project. Starting down that road, it allows us to expand and open a window really on whether or not these compounds are occurring where we don't want them to and what the potential effects are.
So if you could give an estimate, how many different testing methods does the lab use, and how popular are the different methods? How do you handle having so many different methods that you use every day?
That's a great question. On average, we probably offer about 150 different methods every year, and they vary from year to year, and that does make it a bit of a challenge because we have to make sure we have time to validate and show how good the methods are, how sensitive they are, that we can recover them when we go through our sample processing steps. Each year we do validation, which means that we show that we can reproducibly spike and recover everything that we measure from an environmental sample, and we use that to judge the sensitivity and the accuracy of those methods, and we try to do that every year for all of the methods that we offer.
Great. So switching gears a little bit, one project that I think would be especially interesting to our listeners is your partnership with universities in Central Asia. Can you talk about how these collaborations got started and the work that you and other colleagues at the university have been doing?
Yeah, it's a great story. I love to tell the collaboration of how that started with a professor. Actually, he was an assistant professor at Al-Farabi Kazakh National University, and he had just finished his PhD work in uranium isotopes in the Shu River Valley in Kazakhstan. And I happened to run across one of the papers that he published as part of his PhD research, and it turned out it was very similar to what I did for my PhD research here in Nebraska. So I thought, well, because there are so few people working in uranium isotopes in surface water, he might be interested in the paper that I published as part of my PhD research. So I sent him copies of those articles, and then he responded and said, "This is really cool. Are you doing anything else in uranium work?" So I forwarded him some abstracts that I prepared with Dr. Carrie Weber from the School of Biological Sciences, how we were looking at uranium in groundwater. And that's when he invited me to come to do a lecture in the work that we're doing at the University of Nebraska. And we met and became friends and worked on research proposals. It was amazing how easy it was to work in Central Asia. I had never been to Kazakhstan before. In fact, I hadn't heard of Kazakhstan really or thought about it before I started this correspondence with Bolat. But it's amazing how similar the landscape is to Nebraska and the Great Plains, and how similar the people are. So I think I feel a close connection there with their environment and their desire to make the environment better.
So you started with some publications that you shared back and forth, and you led a lecture. What have you been doing in the past 10 years? I know you've gone back a few times to continue this work.
So Bolat and I collaborated on a final paper from his PhD research, and then we submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation, catalyzing new international collaborations program. And we got funded the first time. That's a big surprise to me. Normally, especially with the National Science Foundation, it's very difficult to get funding. But we got that project funded, and that started a whole series of projects focused on water quality in the Sir-Darya river basin, which is in South Kazakhstan. Sir-Darya is one of the major river systems that feed the Aral Sea. And there's a lot of interest in how water quality is in the Sir-Darya, because as many people have heard, the Aral Sea has been declining in terms of volume. It doesn't have nearly the capacity for holding, or it doesn't have as much water in it as it did even 50 years ago. And so we started papers or a project in the Sir-Darya looking at the occurrence of agrochemicals, as well as uranium. And then I invited a colleague from University of Nebraska, Omaha, Alan Kolak, who was aquatic toxicology, to take part in that. He and a professor who was a former graduate student from University of Nebraska, Omaha, and then Shannon Bartelt Hunt. The four of us went over and did sampling with 4 students. I think there was 3 graduate students and 1 undergraduate student that went with us. And we met with the whole team that went out and collected samples from the Sirdaria in one summer. So it was a pretty amazing project, really. I enjoyed that experience a lot.
Definitely. So you've done lectures, workshops, field research. What's one of the most surprising outcomes from these collaborations that has come out?
Well, it's amazing to me how much it grows. It seems like every time I go back to Central Asia, we meet new people and make new connections with people that want to learn about what we're doing here in Nebraska, and apply those methods and those tools and that understanding of agriculture and impacts and the value of water in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. We've had some workshops funded through American Councils for International Education, and those workshops, we've made so many connections with not just Kazakhstan, but Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. All the former Soviet Union countries now are really wanting to learn about water, ways that they can better manage water, and really arid, semi-arid climates like Nebraska.
Are there plans in the works to continue your collaborations in Central Asia?
Oh, absolutely. I go there at least once a year. Last year I visited twice. Not just to Kazakhstan, but we also went to Uzbekistan, and I think we're planning a trip to Kyrgyzstan. There's so much to do and so much to learn about how to manage water in Central Asia, and the comparability between the landscapes in the Great Plains and Central Asia, I think, gives us an advantage maybe over other collaborations that maybe would want to study the same system.
I know you've spearheaded a few other international partnerships through the lab. You're currently hosting 2 visiting scholars from Brazil and are building a new program with university in Portugal. Can you talk about how these partnerships and collaborations get started and the benefit they have both to the lab and to the institute?
So the collaboration from Brazil came about partly because of a program at the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Brazil, I can't think of it is basically to stimulate an exchange between Brazilian scientists and University of Nebraska faculty, and we applied for some funding under that program, and then he also applied for a Fulbright scholarship that basically is paying for his visit to the University of Nebraska. We have 2 scientists, one that's now housed at the Water Sciences Laboratory. Joyce wants to work on methods for analyzing insecticide metabolites in wastewater, which fits in very well with our Altan environmental monitoring study. And then Renato wants to work on treatment technologies for insecticides and pharmaceuticals in wastewater. So because we have the capability at the Water Sciences Lab for measuring these at very low levels, I think we're going to be visited more and more frequently by international scholars interested in the same things.
So you're working with people all over the world. How do they get connected with the lab and your capabilities, since you do have such a unique set of methods that you offer?
So one of the other groups of students that we've had visit the laboratory is from Nigeria. We had a PhD student that visited University of Nebraska, I think, in 2016. And I was also curious about how he came to want to come to Nebraska to finish his PhD work. And it was because of, I think, our publications in water resources and the nice website that we have that illustrates kind of what we do and how we can develop new methods is really made it attractive for other countries to want to send students to Nebraska to learn how we do what we do so that they can take it back to their countries and apply the same methods and the same techniques to studying water resources. So Nigeria, Brazil, Portugal, Kazakhstan, really they're all coming to Nebraska because we have a very unique facility, an amazing resource for studying water that's really not available anywhere else.
Absolutely. So bringing the focus back to Nebraska, what are some current challenges you and the lab are working to address within the state?
I'm pleased that water quality has become a more public issue recently because we all depend on groundwater in Nebraska for our drinking water supply. And many people don't realize how vulnerable it is to contamination from what we do at the surface. And I think more than that, they don't necessarily understand what we can do about it. So I think the laboratory offers methods for identifying sources of nitrogen that lead to nitrate contamination. We also offer methods for measuring insecticides and other pesticides that might be contaminating water, and doing a better job of understanding where we can control contamination and where we might need to be treating for water contamination throughout the state. So nitrate, we talked about the vadose. That's something that we've become pretty well known for. And then also our isotope testing methods where we can distinguish between commercial fertilizer or livestock waste as a nitrogen source for nitrate contamination. That helps the public and natural resources districts decide, well, where do they need to focus their efforts on controlling nitrogen applications and loading to the water table.
Where do you see water quality research heading in the future?
Well, the human health aspect seems to get the most interest, and I don't see that going away. I think water quality research is going to get closer and closer to the point where we know whether or not a contaminant is having an effect on human health. One recent project that I'm working on with Dr. Martha Rhodes is to evaluate whether or not nitroso pesticide metabolites are formed and whether or not they can cause birth defects. So focusing on the occurrence isn't enough. We need to be able to connect the occurrence of these chemicals to effects to human health. And when we do that, I think people really start to understand this is an important subject, and we have to do a better job, I guess, of manage our water quality in the future.
Would you say that the international partners you work with have similar interests when it comes to human health?
Absolutely. As you know, private wells quality is not regulated at all in the United States. It's not regulated at all in any other country, as far as I know. So this potential route of exposure from contaminants occurs everywhere throughout the planet, and people want to know, are these contaminants present, and if they are, could they have a human health effect, and do we need to do something about it?
Do you know if people in different parts of the world are experiencing the same concerns with human health, whether it's nitrate or pesticides, or is it kind of vary by region?
It really varies, and I'm thinking of Nebraska now, is many people seem to not worry that much about nitrate contamination. I think partly because it's a nutrient, it's something that's good for plant growth, and in general that's probably okay. But when we talk about organic contaminants and how they might react differently in the presence of nitrate, I think that's where we need to focus our efforts on, and where people start to think about, well, maybe it's not just nitrate, it might be some of these other contaminants that we're exposed to that could be causing a human health effect, and maybe would be enough to change behavior so that we aren't continuing to pollute our water supplies.
Thanks, Dan. Is there anything else you'd like to add while we're talking?
No, this has been an adventure for me. I didn't come to Nebraska expecting to stay here for my entire career, but it has been an amazing laboratory to study groundwater and water, and really learn about how chemistry could be applied to understanding and solving environmental problems in a way that wouldn't have been possible anywhere else.
Absolutely. Well, those are all the questions I have for us today, Dan. Thank you so much for your time, and I enjoyed learning about your important work in water in Nebraska and around the world.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.